start the record. And it's great to see everyone. Thank you for being here. And I will pass over to Judy Kim, who will be introducing our speakers today.
Hi, I'm Judy, really excited to kick off session 2 of this workshop and really excited to hear from our 2 speakers today, both of whom have done really foundational work on narratives using quite different approaches as well here. So first up, we'll have Dr. Greg Currie, professor of philosophy at the University of York. Greg is also the editor-in-chief currently of Mind and Language and a fellow of the British Academy and the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He's currently thinking about the relationship between art and social cognition, but also writes about film, empathy, poetry, fiction, and knowledge and narratives. So Greg will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 1 or 2 questions. And then around 11:30, we'll go to Monisha Pasupathi, professor of psychology at the University of Utah. Monisha's research focuses on the role of narrative in self and emotion regulation from childhood to later life. She's also the associate dean at Utah and is passionate about applying her thinking around narrative identity and young adult development into her work with students. So with that, really excited to hand it off to our first speaker, Greg.
Thanks very much, Judy. Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Okay, I need to do something there.
Yeah, you have to.
So I need to go back to share screen.
Yep.
Yeah, how's that?
Not yet.
Okay, maybe that's the wrong one. Sorry. That didn't seem to work.
Do you see like the green button that says share screen and it's an arrow?
Yes. Yes, I've clicked that and I've got a number of images up of my screen, and I've clicked on.
Oh, there we go. We have it.
You have it. And
yes,
has it come up in the style? It's just a single screen that you can see, is it?
Yep, just your slides.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks so much. I'll start in that case. Well, thank you so much to Molly and Judy and others who've been involved in putting this together, and for inviting me to participate in something which I haven't really thought about for a while. My book on this came out 10 years ago. And it's been an opportunity to rethink some things. I think some of the things I said probably were not well said. 1 or 2 of them I think I'll very briefly try to put in somewhat different ways. And I think perhaps just 1 or 2 minor points will be new, but there will not really be very much here, I'm afraid, that is really new. So I guess of philosophers, these days we don't worry very much about, what's the philosopher's role, what's the psychologist's role, because we're more comfortable with working across the discipline, and I think that's a good thing. But there are still, I think, distinctive things that a philosopher can bring to these discussions, and one of them is to say, well, sometimes we have a tendency to speak in a certain way that seems comfortable and useful, but then if we really thought hard about that, exactly what do we mean by that? So I don't think that's the only thing that a philosopher can do, but it's one of the things we tend to do. And I will say something about that in a particular case as we go on. Okay, so Right, so I tried to shift my screen to the next page then, and that didn't work, which doesn't sound very helpful. So let me try that again.
Maybe
Okay.
try, clicking on the screen with your mouse. Yes, there we go.
Okay, right. So I'm going to talk about the idea of narrative. That's one of the things I was asked to mention. I'm going to then move on to reliability and narratives, which I think starts to introduce the moral significance of narratives. And I'll connect that notion of reliability with the idea of point of view, which is something I do want to focus on a bit here. And I'm going to finish by arguing that it's really not possible, contrary to the way we often speak, to adopt another person's point of view. So that's how this is going to go. So we start off with this question that comes up so frequently: what is a narrative? And of course, this is very problematic because narratives are everywhere. They're all over the place. Some are very interesting, some are not interesting at all. Many lie in an area between. There are things which we might call minimal narratives. I mean, if I tell you that Albert took one step and then another, I think this is a narrative. It's not a very interesting one, but I wouldn't want to struggle to provide a definition of narrative which ruled it out. So I think the conditions for being a narrative are very, very weak indeed. Something like a representation of specific events in time, that's sort of something that people tend to appeal to. Another notion that people do want to add to that is, well, they say the events have to be causally related. So it's not a narrative unless something that happens, I mean, if just something happens and another thing happens and another thing happens, that's not a narrative. They have to be relations of causal dependence between these events. And while many narratives are like that, I don't think that is a requirement for a narrative. And David Velleman, in his nice article on this some while ago, points to the nice example that Aristotle gave. So here's a little story. Metis of Argos was murdered by somebody, and later on, the murderer was killed when a statue of Metis fell on him, the murderer. So here, I think the primary narrative connection is a moral one rather than a causal one. I mean, you might say, well, when we hear that narrative, we're inclined to think that somehow or other, even if it's not made very clear, the falling of the statue was causally related to the killing because maybe a god intervened to make the statue fall or something like that. But as Velleman says, it doesn't have to, we don't have to see it that way. You could just see it as a kind of absurdist story. This is just how it happened, but it would still, I think, be a narrative, perhaps even to some extent an interesting one. So I don't think that causation is a condition we should impose on narratives. So of course, many narratives do involve causal and interesting causal conditions, and many narratives involve both causal and moral conditions. We do expect that an interesting narrative will have an evaluative element to it, that it will tell us or that it will imply, without necessarily telling us, things about the moral relations between events. And that's a basic feature, I think, of human communicative interest, that we're as interested in who to blame and who to praise, who to trust and who not to trust, as we are in finding out what actually happened. So a narrative may tell us what happened, but if it just does that, that's going to be much less interesting for us than if it helps us get some kind of moral perspective on it, or presents a moral perspective, may present a wrong one, but it's the element of a moral perspective here which makes it interesting for us, or at least it's part of that. So I'm not going to bother to define narrative, and I don't think we should try that. And in a way, it seems like why would you bother to do that? I mean, so if you're thinking about people and the people that you value in your life, and you think about what it is about them that you value, you wouldn't look for necessary and sufficient conditions for them to be that person, because they would just be completely uninteresting features. It would just go down to being something like, well, being that particular person. We value people because of their humor, their kindness, their skills, whatever, and those are not essential properties of people. The valuable, interesting properties are usually not the essential properties, but of course definitions, if they work, only ever get us to essential properties. So I think that's how it is with narratives. Some narratives play an important role in communication, in all sorts of things, in understanding ourselves, instruction, and certainly in entertainment. And the really relevant question is, what is it about some narratives that enables them to do those interesting things? So we do, I think, much better to say, well, look, let's just assume we have a rough working understanding of what a narrative is. Then we're going to look at the narratives which, for whatever reason, we think are important, and we're going to look closely at what makes them work in the way that is important. And then we can see how much we can generalize across cases and develop some kind of general theories about the different functions of narratives and the way those functions are carried out. So having put aside the definitional endeavor, let me place the notion of narrative in a somewhat wider context. So narratives are representations, and they're representations of a particular kind. They are, I'm going to say, and I think someone was kind enough to mention this last week, they are intentional representations. And there are interestingly, I think, no such thing as natural narratives. There are no narratives out there in the world for us to discover. So there are plenty of representations which are like that. The cross-section of a tree branch represents the age of the tree. It represents it very reliably. It's a purely natural form of representation. Narratives are just not like that. There are plenty of natural representations. There are no natural narratives. And narratives belong to a more refined and more interesting class of representation, signals, some of which are natural and some of which are not. So Grice made this distinction between natural meaning and non-natural meaning, which I think many people will know something about. And I think this is really a distinction within the class of signals. Signals take place between living things at a much lower level than narratives do. So they may not be intentional at all. It's been said, and I don't base my claim on this case because I think it's controversial, but that it's been said that bright coloration in birds is a signal of health in birds and plays a role in mating behavior for that reason. Let's assume that that's true. So that's an example of a signal which is not an intentional signal. The bird is not intending to send a signal by having bright coloration. Note importantly that signaling we sometimes think of as conveying information, which to some extent it does. But as Krebs and Dawkins many years ago pointed out, the primary function of signaling is not to provide information, it's to manipulate the creature that you're signaling to. We get lots of examples of that in nature. So here's an example of two snakes look very similar. One is the dangerous coral snake, the other one is the non-dangerous milk snake. They look very similar. The milk snake is disguised as a coral snake for very good reasons, because predators will, at least on a large number of occasions, mistake it for a coral snake, which is dangerous, and not attack it. So the milk snake is getting an advantage by disguising itself and signaling to a predator that it is in fact a coral snake. That's an example of manipulative signaling, but I think even in sophisticated narratives, it's rare to find a narrative that is not to some extent the product of self-advertising, though of course the extent can vary a good deal. Now, because signals are meant to manipulate, the question arises as to their reliability. And in some cases, signals in nature are reliable because they are unfakeable, or at least they're very close to unfakeability. So the typical example is stotting. You can see here that the animal is leaping high in the air. Why? Well, animals tend to do that when there's a predator around. And the theory is, again, I guess this is a theory and not an established fact, that the animal is signaling that it is very healthy and strong, and it's therefore not worthwhile the predator's attempt to attack it. It should concentrate on one of the other creatures that is either not stotting at all or not stotting in such a, not able to lift itself as high off the ground. So those sorts of signals are unfakeable because you can only signal in that way if you actually have the strength and the fitness that you are advertising. So many signals in nature stabilize evolutionarily because of their unfakeability. But it's remarkable that narrative signals are very, very unreliable. So I can say to you, I'm trustworthy, and it's as easy for me to say that as it is for me to say that I'm a cheater. Me saying I'm trustworthy is not very good evidence that I'm trustworthy, because the relationship between being trustworthy and saying that you're trustworthy is a rather weak relationship. Cheaters can say that they're trustworthy just as easily as anybody else can say it. So believing that claim depends on thinking that you're reliable. So I have to think that you're reliable in order to believe your claim that you are reliable, which makes the claim more or less redundant. So we have, I think, developed other less easily fakeable aspects of language that provide useful and less fakeable social signals. So accent, vocabulary, grammar, these are harder, I will not say impossible, harder to fake signs that the speaker is like me, which is important, I think, in communication between people. We are often trying to assess the extent to which another person communicating with us is like us. So the messages that we send in language generally, and that includes narrative, are highly unreliable. And that's one way narrative has a moral dimension. Narratives raise questions more or less automatically about the motives and the reliability of the people who are giving them to us, their narrators. We do have sanctions against narrators who are deceptive or merely unreliable. They can be punished by social ostracism or in more serious cases by the criminal courts, for instance. But it's misleading people with your narrative is always very tempting. And any act of human communication is always, I think, partly an act of self-advertisement, as I suggested before. So there's a trade-off between telling an unreliable but self-serving story and risking sanction if you're discovered. And some of the data that Judy presented in last week's talk, I thought interestingly bore on that question. Coming towards the end now, I want to say something about reliability and point of view in narrative. So we often speak, and I think I heard people use this term already, about subjective points of view. And one question I have is this: well, is there any such thing as a non-subjective point of view? I think that there probably isn't. It seems to me that points of view are always those of some sentient being with perceptions and feelings, interests, and imperfections. And that seems like a good way of saying that they're all subjective. So I don't think calling a point of view subjective really adds anything to it. We might just as well talk about points of view and just accept that points of view are always subjective perspectives on the world. You can compare that again with the rings on the cross section of the tree. The tree rings don't represent the age of the tree from a point of view. They just represent the age of the tree. But narratives always represent from a point of view, and that just means from the point of view of an agent with those kinds of subjective experiences, sentiency, perception, and the rest of it.
Greg, just 4 minutes. You have 4 minutes left.
Okay, moving towards the end. So what then is a point of view? That has been discussed a lot by narrative theorists. And so there's a lot of work in narratology about this. Much of it is concerned with the identification of a narrator within the story who determines how the story is told. It's concerned with the relations between the narrator and the author. And I want to focus on this, the possibility that one might narrate for a story from a point of view that is not your own. And that raises interesting moral issues, because it's often said that point of view in stories is an opportunity for educating people in empathic understanding of others, because it provides training in shifting your point of view to that of another person. Now, I don't want to say that that's entirely a wrong idea, but I do think that there's a severe limitation that we have to consider here. So what is a point of view? I want to say that a point of view, the point of view of a narrator, the point of view of any agent, is defined by the limitations on that agent. So an unlimited being, an omniscient God, doesn't have a point of view. To have a point of view is to see the world, think about the world in some limited way. And the different limits that we have on our ways of understanding ourselves and the world constitute our different points of view. So I will go very quickly here. So let me run past that. because I want to focus finally on this idea of changing your point of view. We speak of adopting another person's point of view, particularly in our relations to other people. We feel that that helps us to understand them. But I think we do need to be careful here, because I think you cannot literally occupy another person's point of view, not, at least not in the sense of point of view that I'm talking about. And the reason for that is the reason that I've already given you, which is to say that your point of view is defined by the things you cannot do. It's the things you cannot see from the position where you are. It's the things you can't believe because you don't have any evidence for them. The things you can't desire for whatever reason that is, the things you can't value. That's not to say that points of view can't change, but at a given time, one is always limited in those various ways. What you can't do is take on another person's limitations. I can't stop being able to think certain thoughts or desire certain things, or even see certain objects. I can close my eyes and not see them, but I can't stop myself being able to see them. So I can't ever take on another person's limitations. All I can ever do is pretend that I have those limitations. And I think it's hard to do that kind of pretending effectively. So I think I'll stop at that point. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I'm so excited also for Monisha's talk now. I think we're going to go straight to Monisha, and then we'll hopefully have like 10 minutes for questions for both speakers. So Monisha, if you want to try sharing your screen. Okay. Thank you, Greg.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I want to also thank Judy and Molly and Lauren for their work organizing, and to say that I regret that I wasn't able to be at the opening. I heard that it was great, and unfortunately that associate dean hat that I wear here bombs my calendar routinely. So hopefully I'll be able to make some of the additional talks in the series, because it looks like a really great collection. So I'm going to talk about how two tales might diverge when people tell the same event to different audiences. And I appreciate that Greg kind of set me up by adopting a very minimalist perspective on what counts as a narrative, which I think is helpful to me. But I want to start by just sort of thinking about what happens when we narrate in social contexts to other listeners, in part to sort of set a bit of a stage. So when we're doing that, what we have is a kind of interplay of here and now when I speak to you about what happened to me, when I narrate to you, and the then and there, which is the events that I'm conveying to you. And in that interplay, listeners matter. And I think they matter. I actually liked where Greg ended with this idea that that we may not occupy someone's point of view in narrative, but we orient our narrative to a person's point of view. And I think that's absolutely true. So when I tell you today in this moment about the ridiculous meeting that I attended yesterday, when I do that, I have to kind of take into account something about what all of you know about meetings in academia, about the kinds of bureaucratic processes that institutions undergo. And I have to provide sufficient context for all of you to understand what happened to me and what I'm doing. And in doing that kind of perspective taking and kind of orienting to what my listeners know, we can talk about the Gricean maxims of providing sufficient information, but not too much information, and the ways in which violating those maxims can, convey additional information. And listeners also matter in that they have relational agendas, and we're responsive to those agendas. And so When I talk to my mother about this meeting, my mother has a different agenda than my colleague might have, right? And I have a different agenda in collaboration with those different listeners. And so finally, when we engage in social narration, we sort of have a point, right? Like, so what are we doing here and now with the then and there? And why are we doing that? Like, what are we trying to accomplish with this telling? And I very much like Greg's point that we're almost never just trying to convey information. Like that is not what these instances are about. So I want to start with just thinking about a couple different points of narration that show up in work that I've done and in work that many people have done, and work out of sociolinguistics and work that my friend Kate McLean has done. And that's that there's sort of a couple different broad points of narration that we see when we look at kind of everyday storytelling. And one of them is that we want to share a subjective truth. We want to talk about what happened to us and what it meant. This, serves intimacy and relationship maintenance functions, and it helps us connect to people. And although we are probably not perfectly reliable narrators in this kind of when we're trying to share subjective truth, we are trying to share our truth, right? So this is my friend Dan Ogilvy, and he might talk about the meaning of this fishing trip in terms of, him approaching end of life issues and having, physical impairments, and this being like the winding down. And that would be this kind of deep telling, right? But a second way that especially fish stories get told is a sort of entertainment and play kind of mode. And, you might think of this as funny and dramatic and light. And the world is full of narratives like this, that have a function of entertaining. And, so the epic battle for these, I think these are flounders. Dan fishes, I don't. No matter which kind of mode we have going on with narrative, they're always evaluative. And I think Greg also mentioned this, they're always evaluative. And sometimes they're explicitly moral. And I am really shaped by moral domain theory and developmental psychology. So when I use the term moral, I really mean that they're bearing on issues of fairness and harm. So I think we always have, sort of a good, bad dimension in narration, but we don't always have that moral dimension. Sometimes we have other things going on. So I want to give an example that lets me sort of show different pieces of this. This is from data we collected in my lab. This is a 13-year-old girl, and she's talking to her mother about a recent event in which she was sent to the principal's office. And so at the point where we come into this transcript, she's saying office of the vice principal, and then we kind of lost the sound. And the mother says, "That's not like you." And the daughter says, "Well, it's beginning to be." And she laughs. And then the mother says, "What were you thinking?" Daughter, "I don't know. Me and Amy, we were just talking." And all of a sudden she's like, "Ladies, let's go." And I was like, "Oops." And then we were in trouble. And the mom says, "No, she gave you more than one warning." And the daughter says, "I know." And the mom says, "So how come you kept drifting back? It's not like you." And then the daughter says, "Well, because I don't like her and I didn't want to do it because it was boring." And then mom says, "There's lots of things you don't like that are boring that you're going to have to do, and you're just going to have to do them." So I like this example because we see just about everything that I just talked about in the one snippet. So we see a lot of evaluativeness, and the daughter is sort of wanting to treat this lightly. So we see some like dramatization. She's like playing the quotes and sort of acting out the scenario. We see that the mom has a relational agenda and it is not aligned with the daughter. So mom is like, "We're going to talk about this deeply because we're going to talk about what it means, and like it's you're violating the kind of personality that I think you have and that I think you should have." And so they're sort of negotiating this. And then they also are negotiating how to understand whether or not, what kind of event this is. And so the daughter is saying, "I don't like her. I didn't want to do it. It was boring." And in the moral domain theory world, this is really about personal autonomy, right? So this is like, I get to choose what I want to do. I get to choose how I want to behave. I don't have to do things just because the teacher says so. And then mom, at this point, mom has different options, right? Like mom could make this a moral event. Mom could talk about the unfairness of being disruptive in class for other people, the way in which that harms the classroom environment. But mom is kind of going a different route here. So sort of going conventional, like sometimes you just have to do things because that's the way the world is and you have to obey. Now, I will say that from a moral intuition framework, this would sort of be moral around obedience and compliance and respect for authority. So there are different perspectives on what counts as moral, and depending on which one you take, this becomes a very moral narrative. So lots is happening just even in these small snippets. And one of the contentions of a lot of my work and the work of people in my little area is that morality, a variety of dimensions of our moral selves arise out of the incremental accumulation of interactions like this with the people that we are in important relationships with. So I don't have the transcript today, but I will tell you that when this girl talked to her best friend about this event, it was, as you might imagine, a very different narrative. They had a lot of fun and they laughed a lot, and it didn't look like the mom story. And so this led us to do, sort of a larger and more quantitatively grounded project in which we brought in 107 13-year-olds. And we chose 13-year-olds because 13-year-olds are on the cusp of a shift from telling narratives primarily with parents to narrating with friends. Sort of in childhood, friendship interactions are a lot more about doing than telling. And the shift happens a little earlier for girls, a little later for boys, maybe. But the shift to sort of telling as well as doing is going on right around this time. We had them come in with same-sex friends and their mother. And we asked them to come up with 3 recent events in which they were angry. Someone did or said something and they felt hurt and angry about it. So these are very often at least somewhat moral events, and they're kind of a victim standpoint narrative typically. And so we randomly assigned those events to be told only to mom, only to friend, and in some cases to be told to both mom and friend. And then we looked at kind of emotions pre and post and their sense that they learned from the event, pre and post conversation. So one of the things we wanted to do really was to document the kind of different narrative contexts that mothers and friends provide. And so we were looking at some features of these conversations, like elaboration. So how much information is produced in a telling with mom versus a telling with friend. Something we call joint engagement, which really looks at the extent to which the listener and the speaker are jointly producing the story versus a listener that's hanging back a little and letting the speaker drive the narrative. The extent to which the conversation was really focused on addressing emotional elements. And then we also looked at the dramatic telling, so kind of performing the story, at whether the listener shared a personal event that was similar to the one that the speaker shared. And we looked at off-topic conversation, in part because in our lab, we've been interested in distraction as an emotion regulation strategy, and off-topic conversation is sort of the narrative version of that. And then we looked at whether there were impacts on, emotional regulation, distress reduction, and learning from experience. So I think anyone who's ever looked at adolescents talking to, in any setting will not be surprised by what we found. And I think, we're not surprised. We're mostly trying to sort of document the extent of this, but mothers really produce a more elaborative listening context than friends. And Kate and I have some work with imagined audiences in young adulthood, and this kind of more elaborative context of mothers actually persists and is in some ways internalized by young adulthood. So mothers are really getting kids to produce a richer, more detailed recollection of what happened. Mothers are also kind of more engaged in the joint telling, and they are a little more focused on sort of pulling out the kind of emotions and desires and addressing those elements of the story. So all of this is kind of almost a therapeutic role of moms, like let's, get everything out there and make sense of it, try to learn things from it, try to understand ourselves and others. And this is consistent with the kind of narrative role that mothers play in early childhood. So friends do something different. Friends are more likely to elicit dramatic reenactment by the narrator, to do the dramatic reenactment themselves, to share their own stories of similar things or their own related stories, and also to go into off-topic conversation. And so I'm going to skip this slide. This is the slide I showed you with the mom, and we'll look at one with a friend, and this is a kind of typical friend story from this study. So the narrator says she got like really mad at me, and I was just like, how could you be so self-absorbed? You get mad at me for not giving you bobby pins? Like, it's a bobby pin. And she's like, well, I'll go ask one of my really friends then. And the friend listener says, what the heck? This is Utah, so we don't use the full word. And I'm like, you're real friends. Okay. I'm like, thanks. And then the friend says, sounds about like her though. Narrator says, I know, she's gotten like kind of crazy. Like all the time she'll say stuff to me and I'm like, bro, how necessary was that? And then the friend offers her own story about the same individual in dance, similarly sort of doing something offensive. And then the narrator actually says, what the heck, kind of echoing the friend's response. So this is a really different kind of story than what we get when we look at moms. And, the mom version of the story goes into some consideration about what might be going on with this friend and like, and tries to get the child to kind of build a somewhat more forgiving story without promoting being a doormat. Whereas the friend is sort of kind of creating an alliance and a perspective in which there is someone to blame here and there is a bad guy in this story, and it's this friend who is behaving badly and creating conflict in an unnecessary way. So
just another 4-minute warning for you to
okay. Well. I'm really close to the end. So it's probably not surprising that friends elicit larger reductions in distress. They do also elicit larger reductions in learning, and I'm happy to talk about that later. It's, everybody reports less learning after they talk than before, which is not what we expected. But this kind of entertaining telling is clearly more positive for emotion outcomes, right? People feel better when they tell the friend story than when mom makes them think about the complexities of the experience. And our conclusion here is that moms and friends really create distinct affordances in the way that they narrate. And we do know, and you could see on the figures that this is not a massive split, right? So mothers also do some of this entertainment telling, and friends do some of this more, sort of subjective truth, kind of elaborative listening. So it's not that this is a pure distinction by any means, but generally mothers and friends are doing different things. And the question I want to pose in this context is what this might mean for the implications for morality and moral development that come from narrating. So when reflection is the point, I think we understand that these elaborative listening contexts really give people kind of the scope to explore different perspectives, to explore what might be going on, however imperfectly, if we take Greg seriously, however imperfectly, but to at least explore the point of view of other people involved in the incident, and potentially to come to a more forgiving stance on themselves and on other people. And there's a good bit of work by others going on, I think, around this. There's very little consideration, I think, up till now about entertainment-oriented narration and what it might mean for morality. I think in the data that we have, you can kind of see that it solidifies alliances of us and them, sort of the two of us, the cool girls that are like, low key and not hostile, and then this kind of crazy person who's messing up friendships. So that, of course, will have benefits and costs for narrators and for the broader world. It also may have a sleeper impact in that when we do entertainment narration, there's a lot that isn't articulated, that's just assumed, that's kind of in the backdrop. And that kind of assumptions and sort of unarticulated, taken for granted kind of ideas and values may be one way that we see, master narratives playing out over time. And I think, but we could also think of ways in which these tellings might support some acceptance of our own and others' imperfections. And I think there's just a lot more questions than answers at this point about these kinds of tellings, and that's where I'll stop.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Monisha. And I think we have time for questions for either Monisha or Greg. Let me answer this. We have a question from Varun.
Hi everybody. Hi Judy. Thanks a lot for organizing this workshop. It's been extremely interesting and fascinating to listen to both Monisha and Professor talk. I just had one question. I often believe that our actions and the decisions that we take in moral dilemmas depend on our own perception of our own personality and what other people's perception is of our personality. So is there any literature or research on this, on how our moral decisions depend on our own perception of our personality and what others think about us? Because from contributing to charity or contributing to any other noble causes, we might behave differently when others are around us, and we might take a different decision of not contributing when we are alone, when we are left alone. So this, I often have observed this behavior in a lot of people in a lot of contexts, and they have themselves told me that I wouldn't have done this or I wouldn't have contributed to this charitable cause had I been alone. So so that is why I believe that our actions depend on what other people think of us and what we ourselves think of ourselves.
So I don't know that I would use the word personality in that context. And Greg may have a different response to this too, but what I think of when, with what you're saying is that you're talking about moral actions that are in the sort of pro-social domain, like donations, and these are discretionary, which means you can choose to do them or not do them, and then the impact of being watched, it turns those actions into kind of an impression management strategy, which I think, so I think that might be the literature that would be helpful. So it's less that I want, it's less about my personality per se, and it's more that I want to look like a moral person. And this is a discretionary act. A lot of the work that I do in my lab looks at moral harm, which is not discretionary, right? And which is not as varied, right? Everyone acknowledges when they hurt other people that the hurting of other people is wrong and regrettable. So I think I might look at that sort of pro-social morality and impression management as a kind of place to start to grapple with the question that you're asking.
Absolutely, Monisha. So where I'm coming from is that
I think so. There's a lot of questions, so I think we're not going to do follow-ups, but then move on to other people's questions if you don't mind. Sorry, Vern. Okay. Sorry, because we don't have a lot of time, and I actually want to get to a lot of these other questions. If you don't, unless Greg, you wanted to reply to that too. No. Okay. Okay. Thank you, David.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question for Greg actually. Just when you talked about narration being often to do with manipulation, I mean, well, one comment is manipulation works. It is also about informativeness as well. So it has to work against a, typical informativeness. Otherwise, manipulation is not going to work. But what I kind of wanted to ask about was you talked about ways of signaling reliability. And it seemed to me that one obvious way is the content of what you're saying and how that fits with other people's beliefs in order to, build trust and that kind of thing. But then you have this kind of juggling act of both, well, someone might be doing that in order to convince you that they should believe you in order to manipulate you. So I found that kind of trade-off or that puzzle really interesting. I was just wondering whether you'd, if you have any kind of like insights about that kind of almost simultaneously having to judge the truth of what someone's saying and judge the kind of reliability of them as a narrator, and how that kind of plays out in your scheme of things.
Yeah, I mean, so there are sort of complex and reciprocal relationships between these two dimensions, I guess. One is, as you point out, few of us want to listen to a narrative that is purely self-serving. We're largely going to be hooked by narratives that at least purport to tell us something that we are interested in and feel that we might benefit from knowing. So any narrative that's going to have any chance of success will have these two dimensions to it. It will be informative, or at least it will have the appearance of being informative. I mean, it may be a pack of lies, in which case it wouldn't be informative at all, but it needs to have at least the appearance of being informative, as well as serving these other less explicit goals. And if you're, I mean, I've sort of said, perhaps I've set this up wrongly, because I've kind of suggested that these are two independent dimensions, but in a way they're not, because the informativeness of a narrative itself tells you something about the qualities of the narrator. So it's not as if there is informativeness along one dimension and the extent to which the narrative serves the goal of presenting yourself well along another narrative. Somehow it's going to have to be more complicated than that, because each of these is feeding into the other one. Yeah, that's good. I don't really have a clear way of depicting that, but we're clearly going to have to get away from the two-dimensional picture. Yeah, thank you.
And then I think I'm going to take a question from Erica Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you both for the excellent talks. And this question, I think, is mostly for Monisha. So I assume that when people seek out someone to whom share their story, there's like a goal-directed manner in which they choose their audience. So I go to my mom for certain things, and I go to my friends for certain things when I have sort of like a instrumental goal in my emotion regulation. But let's say I'm talking to strangers. And so my question is, I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of engineer narratives in order to meet these certain regulatory goals that I have as a narrator when I go and talk to people that I don't know, for whom I don't have expectations about how they'll respond.
So it's a nice question. One thing that I didn't talk about here, but that has been, part of my earlier work and comes out of really a linguistics standpoint, is that any kind of narration that you engage in is really it's a really intricate dance between what you are producing and what your listeners are doing, second to second. And so some of the ways in which we get around the fact that we're talking to someone we don't know is that we're looking for a lot of signals of comprehension, continued attention and interest and engagement. And then we're sort of tuning to those signals. And that is true for strangers and non-strangers alike. So in my lab, we've manipulated the attentiveness of listeners by giving them distraction tasks. And we've done that with established friendships where the people who are talking to one another have been in a friendship for more than 5 years, and it's still, you know, that micro level of the interaction has a really strong effect on the kinds of stories people tell. So when you go to talk to strangers, you know, you might be doing that in a bid. I think one of the most routine things people do when they talk to new people is they're, you know, sussing out whether they want to initiate and then, you know, kind of explore a relationship with this person of some kind of friendship, you know, something, right? And but in the narrative moment, you are looking for all these tiny signals. You don't even know you're looking for it. You know, but you know when they're disrupted, you know, and you're responsive, even at the kind of micro level of disfluencies and all the way to the macro level of how much you tell and how long you talk. So I think that's the way we do this with unfamiliar partners. And in those cases, often there's like a context that provides for some point. So, you know, there's the Jamie Pennebaker wrote this really funny book about narrating to like bartenders and taxi drivers, and like, you know, people where you can like leave a story, you can put a story out there and leave it behind and like never never talk to the person again. And it's been years and years since I read that book, so I don't remember exactly what he thought the point of those narrations were, but in terms of like how you tune your stories, you're always on the micro level.
Cool, thank you so much.
We're at time now, so I think we're gonna have to close. If anyone has more questions, feel free to follow up via email. And thank you to both of our speakers, and thank you to our audience. And we hope to see you all next time.